at the start of our broadcast is take you sector by sector. Remember, when you look at the Indian border, which is about 3,488 kilometers long with the Chinese army, there are three sectors. You've got the northern sector, the Central Army Command, and then the Eastern Army Command. So let's go sector by sector, then we'll go across into China and show you the kind of deployment on the Chinese side of the border, and then we'll tell you why India actually has the edge. So first is the Northern Army Command, which is Uttarakhand and Ladakh, and of course along the Pakistan border, which is the line of control. But right now we're dealing with the line of actual control. We're dealing with part of Himachal Pradesh and with Ladakh. That's the Northern Army Command, which has 34,000 troops. Then there is the Central Army Command, which is largely in the Uttarakhand sector, which is 15,500 troops, and I'm dealing only with the part of the army that is currently taking on China. Let's shift now to the Eastern Army Command, which is the bulk of India's fighting force against China, which is 1,75,000 people. So if I combine the Eastern Army Command, the Central Army Command and the Northern Army Command, we've got 2,25,000 boots on the ground to take on China. Let's now look at what we're up against on the Chinese side. Now, the three sectors again, we'll start with the Tibet Military District, which has 40,000 army personnel across the Tibet Military District on the Chinese side to take on India, which is the longest boundary that they have, which is just opposite India. Then they also rely on troops which are currently in the Xinjiang Military District, which is 70,000. But as you see on the Chinese map, a lot of these troops are much further away from the India border, but this is part of China's fighting formations against the Indian army. Then finally, there is the Western Theatre Command, which is between roughly 90,000 to 1,20,000 army personnel. So if you combine three military commands, the army commands of the Chinese army, that's 2,04,000 to 2,34,000. Let's now compare how this compares between the Indian army that's deployed. So we've got 2,25,000 boots deployed on the ground to take on the Chinese army. China has between 2,04,000 and 2,34,000, but a fair part of this, and we'll build into this once we start our conversation with the military experts, a fair part of the Chinese army is actually quite far away from the India-China border, and therefore they're not able to mobilize quite as quickly because the Indian army that's deployed in the north and the east is deployed directly against the Chinese. So that's a ground forces comparison. Let's now do the same with the Air Force, and I'll start with showing you the Indian air bases, the kind of fighter jets we have, and then compare them with the Chinese. So let's start with the Western Air Command. This is the Western Air Command, which we're dealing with right now. So while a large part of the fighting force of the Western Air Command is actually directed against Pakistan, but a lot of these air bases at places like Srinagar, Pathankot, Adampur, Ambala can be used against China as well. And then of course there is the base at Leh, where we have 75 fighters, 34 ground attack aircraft in the Western Air Command of the Indian Air Force. The Central Air Command, which has air bases in Bareilly, Gwalior and Gorakhpur in eastern Uttar Pradesh, have 94 fighters and 34 ground attack aircraft. After this, let's now come to the Eastern Air Command, and you've got Tezpur, Chabua, Jalpaiguri, and I'm not including over here the AGLs, which are the Advanced Landing Grounds, which is essentially you've got in the forward areas airstrips where we can land military aircraft, but which are not as well equipped as a regular airbase would be. But when you need to push and land military transport aircraft there, you want to send your equipment, they most certainly can be used. The Eastern Air Command is 101 fighters. So if I combine all these three, you've got the Western Air Command with 75 fighters, 34 ground attack aircraft, the Central Air Command 94 fighters, 34 ground attack aircraft, the Eastern Air Command with 101 fighters. So that's the Indian Air Force that's deployed against the Chinese Air Force. Now let's see what we're up against on the other side. So we'll start with the Western Theatre Command of China, which is 157 fighters in the Western Theatre Command. They also have 20 precision strike unmanned aerial vehicles, and then they've got 12 ground attack reconnaissance UAVs in the Western Theatre Command and 12 precision strike UAVs, and you've got 8 electronic warfare and reconnaissance systems. So if you were to compare, and this is the data that's available for the Chinese Air Force, which is deployed on the other side, 157 fighters, 20 precision strike unmanned aerial vehicles, 12 ground attack reconnaissance UAVs, 12 precision strike UAVs, 8 reconnaissance and electronic warfare systems. Let's compare the Indian Air Force with the Chinese Air Force to give you a sense of how they come across. So on the Chinese side, broadly speaking, you've got 157 fighter craft. On the Indian side, you've got 270 and you've got 68 ground attack aircraft. So what we've been able to demonstrate over the past few minutes, just as we started this conversation, is whether it comes to the Indian military or the Indian Air Force, India actually enjoys an edge in conventional weapons against the Chinese army that is deployed against us. The net, the Chinese army itself is bigger, but you've got a lot of their deployment in areas which aren't along the India-China border. So if you look at just the army that you're up against, India actually has the military edge. Here's our lead story tonight.
这次我们实施机动战场，无论是兵力投入规模还是投入方式，都较以往有了重大突破，极大的拓展了。
A show of strength. On Mouthpiece Media.
作为铁路运输部门，我们有责任和义务充分发挥铁路。
A propaganda video displaying China's swift troop movement. From Hubei to the southwestern plateau near India. Multiple cameras, high-end production, and a quick broadcast on government-controlled outlet. All in the middle of talks over the Ladakh deadlock. But the standoff isn't the only backdrop. This report, which came out in March, might have unnerved China. This independent publication by the Harvard Kennedy School in Massachusetts makes it crystal clear to China that the India of 2020 isn't the India of 1962. This independent research analyzed distribution and strength of strategic assets and military units of the two Asian giants. The conclusion is blunt. If it comes to an escalated warlike situation, India holds a strategic edge over China on its northern boundaries. The analysis points out China's logistics trouble of moving its troops from Russian tasking to Indian borders. A significant number of Chinese troops remain unavailable for countering insurrection in Xinjiang and Tibet. The analysts also point China's inability to counter India's air defense in one go. The research identifies India's China-centric asset deployment, strategic distribution of air and land assets, and experience of high-altitude theatre as a key advantage over China. Not to forget India's dedicated army strike force along the northern and eastern borders. In conclusion, this independent research endorses India's confident stance. 2020 is no 1962. The study has also considered nuclear capabilities of both countries and observes how India's no first use doctrine assures retaliation and builds doubts in China's strategy. According to the research, India's adequate but secret force dispersal across air, land and sea makes things much tougher for China.
The Indian military is very capable, the army is battle-hardened, they are rich. We have what we call permanent defenses on our side. We are capable of standing firm out there without any second thoughts about whatsoever. His rapid deployment capability, what he talks about in terms of infrastructure, in terms of helicopters, fine. But these are high altitude areas. These are 4,500 meters, 5,000 meters, and people, the soldiers have to get acclimatized out there. We are acclimatized. We are stationed out there. So our units are very well done out there. So we can stand firm.
Several wars fought against each other, including...
The lead researcher of this study, Frank O'Donell, is a non-resident fellow in the Stimson Centre South Asia program. He also offered a word of caution. According to him, the PLA used military exercise as a feint to move the troops this time, and that India should do a Kargil-level review of its intelligence. Under domestic and global pressures, the Chinese leadership may be looking for diversions. But as the analysts point out, it's difficult for China to spring a surprise in an escalated situation with India, because 2020 is not 1962. With Ankit Kumar, Bureau Report, India Today.
So we'll take it sector by sector with very distinguished military veterans who've been in charge of key formations of the Indian Army and Air Force. I want to welcome first Air Marshal P.K. Barbora. He's been the ex-Vice Chief. He's been Eastern Commander of the Indian Air Force. And importantly, he is the officer who reactivated the DBO airstrip by landing an AN-32 aircraft over there. And the Daulat Beg Oldie airstrip was activated after the India-China war in 1962, but then it became defunct, and it was a very significant signal sent to China when we reactivated it, and the officer who did it is live with us on the show this evening. Lieutenant General Jaswal has commanded the Northern Army Command, which is where the current skirmish with China is taking place. That's where the current standoff is happening, so he understands that area really well. We also have with us on this broadcast an officer who's been in charge of the Eastern Army Command at the time of the Doklam standoff. Lieutenant General Abhay Krishna joins us, and he's dealt with the Chinese and therefore has a very interesting perspective. Lastly, I have Frank O'Donell. He's a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Centre's South Asia program. He's the one who at the Harvard Kennedy School wrote that research paper, The Strategic Postures of China and India. So welcome to all our guests. I want to go across to General Jaswal first, because it's in the Northern Army Command in the Ladakh sector where the current skirmish, current standoff between the Indian and the Chinese armies is taking place. General Jaswal, we just took our viewers through, on the basis of what's available in the public, a sense of a force comparison between the Indian and the Chinese armies. And as an army brat and somebody who follows the Indian military, it gives me great confidence and assurance that man to man, equipment to equipment, we are more than just well matched against the Chinese army. As the man who's commanded the Indian Northern Army, why don't you give us your sense of how you evaluate this force comparison between the Indian Army and the Chinese army in the area that you commanded, the Northern Army?
Good evening, panelists and Rahul. Rahul, I've also served extensively. Half my service is in 4 Corps, which controls Arunachal. I was a corps commander there. So I'll be able to vindicate what General Abhay Krishna is very experienced and been the army commander there. So I'm fully aware of that area. Now coming to Northern Command, your question, I'll make certain issues very clear, which will probably set the stage. One, force to force numbers, they do not matter just on numbers. It depends on the kind of terrain friction and the ratios which will be required by the opponent to build to take on the defensive formations. Secondly, that is 1:12, 1:15 in these areas. They're very high altitude areas. So to develop a force of that nature against India for China, well, it may be slightly difficult. Secondly, what exactly is the policy of India? As far as India is concerned, we want to prevent war with China, then war avoidance, and of course if war waging comes, it is perfectly fine. Since the ratios, I mean China has a larger army, we also cannot build up the ratios to go on an offensive against China. So we will have to draw in the enemy, the Chinese, into a battle of attrition. Terrain friction here is going to play a very major role. And I think we are very strong, we are capable. He may capture certain areas because still our troop to ground density which is there along this LAC, that requires improvement. But we have certain reactions to it. We should be able to. But this 646 kilometers of LAC the ideal troop-to-ground density requires a bit of a look into it. Last of all, I would also like to make a mention. The Chinese philosophy is not to get into a man-to-man war, kind of soldier-to-soldier war. They want to win all without fighting. And let me tell you, you have not mentioned in their capabilities, their cyber capabilities with which they can undermine a country if in case they resort to that, as also the low-level EMP strike capability which the Chinese army has. So they can wipe out the communications at the military level and they can undermine the whole economy, create confusion in India. And it is known of the Chinese that they use war, of course, in the sense to derive political decisions. They will go up to a stage, make a statement, back off, and thereafter they go on for a thing called a QBQR. First is the internal intensity, external calm, then you have the EFSA, then you have the QBQR, and then of course the asymmetric warfare. So they have stages, but they would like to win all without fighting.
Okay, Lieutenant General Abhay Krishna, you've been Eastern Army Commander, especially at the time of the Doklam crisis. Very recently, you've stared the dragon in the eye and been able to come off strong. Welcome. Give us a sense of, your assessment of the Indian Army's force along the Eastern Army Command and what you're up against on the Chinese side.
Thank you very much for getting me here. At the outset, I will say that I fully endorse what General Jaswal has said. Virtually, he has covered everything, whether it applies to the eastern sector or the western sector or the central sector. The fact remains that these wars are not fought on mathematical basis. But definitely, as far as Arunachal and Sikkim is concerned, we are in a much better advantageous position because we dominate them. And in the high altitude area, a lot of restrictions are imposed on the employment of the equipment and troops. And here in Sikkim and Arunachal, we are dominating them and in most of the areas. Secondly, if you see Arunachal per se, Arunachal is divided into valleys. So that itself gives a tremendous advantage to the defender in case if we are waiting for the Chinese to attack. But in today's warfare, I don't think that philosophy should be applicable because there are so many opportunities that we have across Arunachal and Sikkim where we should not be waiting for them to attack, or if they have done something somewhere, then we should immediately retaliate and go into their territory. Now, if that happens, then the entire equation changes. All the mathematical calculations and the comparison that you have given, it totally changes because their force which was supposed to come into our area then gets diverted to tackle those intrusions by the adversary or by us. So having said that, one point I will like to draw attention here of everybody is that today China has got 5 theatre commands. It is only the Western Theatre Command which is taking care of Chinese border from Arunachal right up to the Western Theatre of theirs. That is their border with the Central Asian Republic, which itself is 3,300 kilometers long. So what kind of priority are they giving to this site? Because Western Theatre Command has got only 23 combined arms brigade, that's all. Rest of the formations they will have to pull out from the other theatre commands, and the other 4 theatre commands are looking after the eastern coast. And why is so eastern coast important to China? Because their complete infrastructure of the economy is based on eastern coast. You must have heard about the Pearl River Delta, that itself, that small hub, it contributes to 1/3 of the Chinese economy. So that is the area which they are very, very threatened of. Now, as far as the equation of the troops are concerned, very well said. You have also given out the analysis of that study and General Jaswal has also endorsed it. I will just bring out here 2 points. One is the cyber capability, which General Jaswal has also spoken about it. Definitely China has an edge today, as of now, as also in the airspace, as also in the intercontinental ballistic missiles. Now, if you remember, some time ago, we have also developed ourselves in the airspace capability, and we knocked down satellites in the lower orbit. So as far as that is concerned, I think we are already moving ahead to neutralize that capability of theirs. We have also created a cyberspace division, I mean, and that also is a move forward of the Indian Army to come Chinese into that field.
Air Marshal P.K. Barbora, the three things as far as the Air Force is concerned that stood out for me. One, the fact that the Sukhoi 30 MKI, which is our lead fighter aircraft, enjoys superiority in comparison with the aircraft that the Chinese have in their theatres, which is the J-11 and the Sukhoi 27 model. Secondly, a lot of the high altitude bases of the Chinese limit their ability to carry payloads in their aircraft, whereas India is coming from air bases which aren't restricted by geography, and therefore you're up against an aircraft which is coming from a high altitude and therefore can't fly with a full payload. Give us your sense of a comparison between the capabilities of the Indian Air Force and their Chinese adversaries.
Okay, now unlike the Indian Army, where once you deploy them and they have got into their fortified defensive formations, it's very difficult for them to redeploy. So you can replenish those, but it's very difficult to be able to redeploy at short notice for I would say for a short duration conflict. Indian Air Force in that respect is got a phenomenal amount of rapid redeployment capability. We have done it in the past and we have practiced it also. Whether the forces are in the north, west or in the east, they can be redeployed very fast because of also force multipliers that we have, that are the air-to-air refueling capabilities. Now, comparison of numbers I don't think is the correct thumb rule. If you take the whole of Chinese Air Force, they're much bigger than us. Yes, the main concentration is to the east, on the eastern borders. That means not eastern border between India, but on the eastern coast itself. Because they've got their problems there, they've got Japan, they've got Spratly Islands to look after, they've got Taiwan, they've got their own issues, and I don't think China can deploy everything towards India by any chance, and even if they do and a war has started, they can't remain naked on this side. The comparison of the aircraft performance, yes, I would say 19-20 का फर्क है, but presently the Sukhoi MKI is a better aircraft, there is no doubt, and with the coming in of the Rafale, which will be deployed in the east as well as in the north or northwest for that matter, these aircraft are definitely superior at the present moment, or likely to be superior in comparison with the Chinese, unless they come out with something different. Now, it is you are right, you have already analyzed it. We will be operating from airfields. We've got about 14 airfields that we can use towards the northern sector only. 14 airfields. We've got starting from Leh, Tois, your Avantipur, Leh, Pathankot, Adampur. You can go down the line, Ambala, and you even use Central Air Command bases to launch there. Haven't we launched the Mirages all the way to Balakot? So this is a shorter distance. And so we have no issue there. Yes, you are right, we can carry more load. We require more force multipliers, definitely. Chinese, although they have a disadvantage of the load carrying capabilities and the numbers at this moment, because the launch bases are limited, especially in the opposite Ladakh area, etc. Maximum they've got 4 or 5 they can put in from somewhere or the other. It is going to be a tricky situation for the Chinese to match our force levels if there is not a dual front confrontation. You see, that is going to be problematic for them. But I'd like to, you see, we cannot somehow factor the nuclear factor into this whole game. Our aircraft, where it is concerned, we have nuclear capable aircraft today. Obviously, we can go further deep inside. But even silos which are in the east, in the Eastern Command area, and I understand that the range is now just encompassing Beijing. Anytime that thing happens, the Chinese are a little worried because they cannot be made to look humble if someone were to take on a target like Beijing and we go nuclear. So it is very unlikely that nuclear will ever be used.
Okay.
But we have to cater for it somehow.
So
we
you've
have
spoken
to cater
of
for it.
nuclear weapon systems. Can I just go across and show our viewers a comparison between the nuclear capabilities? And you know, I say this with a lot of caution. Nobody wants to go into that realm. But given the fact that the Chinese are staring the Indian Army in the eye, you need to know what the capabilities of your armed forces are, and that's very assuring because this is completely mutually assured destruction, and we just hope that it never really comes down to that. So that being said, let me first take you through the range of the weapon systems that have nuclear warheads. China has 104 missiles, and in India has about 8 Agni 3 launchers which can actually reach any part of mainland China, and the Chinese missiles as well can reach any part of India. If you want to get into missiles, they have missiles which have a longer range than ours, going up to 11,000 kilometers, which are the intercontinental ballistic missiles. You've got the DF-31, which has a range of about 7,000 kilometers. And then, but the reality is that the Agnis that India has the capability of reaching any part of China. And then, as Marshal Barbora said, you also have 51 nuclear certified aircraft with gravity bombs, which can be deployed if the need so arises. Now, Frank O'Donell, you are the author of the study which is the basis of our show. Give our viewers a sense of your dispassionate view from the outside when you looked at the military capabilities of the Indian Army and Air Force, and net, how did they fare against what the Chinese have up against us?
Yes, the report really started from, which I think the panelists will agree with me, that there's a common tendency in India. It's partly an overhang, a hangover from the 1962 war, to assume that China will always be militarily superior to India. And what we wanted to do is to develop the first open source study of Chinese and Indian major combat positions platforms as they were based against each other. And the reason we included the nuclear part of it, which I and everybody here agree should not even be part of the discussion with regard to the current crisis, is that because there's a sense that this Indian sense of weakness then feeds into nuclear planning, and we need to have further reaching nuclear missiles. And the study shows that the existing Indian nuclear force that we say is adequate. I'd just like to respond to a couple of points I made earlier by some of the gentlemen who joined me today. I agree that firstly, on the point that a sheer number-to-number comparison is always going to be a rudimentary way of doing it. And one thing that came out in the discussion on the Air Force that we also talk about in the report is the disadvantages posed by the terrain and by the altitude that face the Chinese forces more compared to the Indians. So we saw that Chinese propaganda video of them shipping, hundreds of Chinese forces across toward the border areas. What it doesn't show is that they then have to be acclimatized. Otherwise they will suffer altitude sickness. And so they will immediately slow down their mobilization. By comparison, because India has a lot more forces, more forward located, that is not as much of a concern for India. And yes, it's similar with the terrain. On the cyber capabilities too, this is part of the limitations of this as an open source report. I'm sure that, as the gentlemen here know, this is going to be classified. There's no way we can know this, but that is an important part of it that needs to be factored in. Overall, I think that aside from what is happening in Ladakh, the overall point of the military balances have not changed. There's a report today by Ajay Shukla in The Wire talking about how there's been apparently no Chinese military activity at all around Arunachal Pradesh and the Eastern Command. And that India holds these overall conventional force advantages even though due to the tactical surprise that China sprung on India and turning a major military exercise, which would end up being a feint, into the diversion toward Ladakh. That has led to certainly a stalemate in that area, but across the line of actual control as a whole, the same advantages still remain for India.
You know, the other thing that's very interesting, and I want you, Frank O'Donell, to highlight that, is the fact that a lot of the troops that China on paper says are deployed against India are actually used to deal with the unrest in Tibet and Xinjiang, and therefore if in the case of a confrontation with the Indian Army and Air Force, China needs to pull it up, pull those forces out and surge them towards the border, it throws open the possibility of there being unrest in areas like Xinjiang and in Tibet where those forces are currently deployed. Frank?
Yes, that's absolutely true, and that's a reason why, following the big Chinese military reforms, India faces really a tripartite Chinese, three different Chinese military commands. There's the Western Theater Command that's been spoken about, but there's also the Tibet and the Xinjiang military districts. And the reason, and I mean, all the forces of all three count toward the total in our report, but the reason Tibet and Xinjiang and Beijing are the only three type of military districts that have their own kind of setup like that, that have their own kind of naming in China. And they're also each of them is run by the army as opposed to the Joint Theater Commander with the major theater commands. The reason why there is a separate Tibet and Xinjiang military district, and why it has a separate organization, is because, and why it's run by the army, is because of its primary concern with managing unrest, domestic unrest in Tibet and Xinjiang. And it's the same with the third one in Beijing, is that they want to have a special focus on the political stability and around Beijing. So when we calculate the total number of forces, and those including the Tibet and Xinjiang military forces, we have to bear in mind that the names of those military organizations reflect the fact that it's based upon internal stability, and that we can't assume that China would throw the majority of its military forces or be able to add India into a major conflict because of that focus upon maintaining internal stability in Xinjiang.
So I don't want to build a specter of war, and we're not bloodthirsty seeking that there be war. That's not what this is about. But what we tried to do on the broadcast this evening is to give our viewers a sense of confidence, a sense of assurance that if push comes to shove and the Chinese refuse to back out, and any of these border skirmishes and fisticuffs lead to a shootout, and that leads to an escalatory spiral which can't be controlled, be more than assured that the Indian Army and the Indian Air Force are up to the task, and the Chinese will get more than just a bloody nose. This is a battle that China knows it cannot win. The India of 2020, and that's the key thrust of the study that Frank O'Donell has done, and every one of us knows that, but it's important to put the numbers to it as well. The India of 2020 is not the India of 1962. Air Marshal P.K. Barbora, Lieutenant General B.S. Jaswal, Lieutenant General Krishna and Frank O'Donell for joining us on the Newstrack. Thank you very much.